Let's continue to talk about perceiving people, but this time let's focus on attribution theories. In order to understand people, we really need to be able to make sense of why they do what they do. In other words, we need to attribute a cause of their behavior. Attribution theories describe exactly that, how we explain the causes of people's behaviors. Look at Mother Teresa there. We're trying to understand why she spent her entire career, her entire life, helping poor people. And most of us, if you're familiar with her, are able to see that she engaged in those behaviors because it really told us something about her and her personality. She was a very warm, very loving person who felt a strong call to help other people. So in that case, there was this corresponding inference we can draw between her behavior and her personality. Now, it's not always quite that easy. Here's someone who we encounter who is a volunteer for Habitat for Humanity. Now, like Mother Teresa, this person might have an incredibly caring, generous personality, and he might be engaging in those volunteering behaviors to help other people, and that might be the true cause. So in that case, again, we can draw a correspondent inference between his behaviors and his personality. But it's not quite as simple as that, because we also realize that people who volunteer for Habitat for Humanity can accumulate some credits essentially, so that later on, if they need housing, they're going to be the person on the top of the list. And when people are building the houses, it's going to be this guy who gets the house. So do you see how in that situation, we're not necessarily able to say that he engaged in these behaviors because of something about him? He's a warm, caring person. He might have engaged in these volunteering behaviors because of what he's going to eventually get out of that, and that is a house. Well, Fritz Heider would analyze the way that people would come to these types of explanations and conclusions. And in general, he found two basic categories, and that is that people can draw personal attributions and determine that people are engaging in behaviors because of something internal about the person, meaning specifically their personality, their disposition, their attitudes. Let me give you an example of that real quickly. Look at James Comey. He's the director of the FBI. One reason why he's in the news a lot right now is because several days before the election for president, he let it become publicly known that the FBI was continuing the investigation on Hillary Clinton and her emails. Now, a lot of people were pretty upset by this because they thought that he was releasing that information because of his true political beliefs, and that he is a conservative Republican, and that he realized that by releasing that information, it would help his cause and hurt Hillary Clinton's campaign. Do you see how that's an internal attribution? That's a personal attribution. That's saying he engaged in these behaviors because it tells us something about him and his traits and his attitudes. Now, Heider realized that people can also make another type of attribution. They can explain behaviors in another way. And that is not by saying that the behaviors betray something about the person, but that they tell us more something about the situation that the person was operating under. So situational attributions are more external in nature. They're more circumstantial. Let's go through that exact same example for a minute, but now looking at it from someone who's making a situational attribution. They might say, yes, James Comey released information about a continued FBI investigation into Hillary Clinton, but it wasn't because he's a Republican. It wasn't because he thought it was going to hurt Hillary Clinton's campaign. It was because he understood that in this situation, he had to provide the American people with all the information that he could. Because he realized if he sat on that information after the election, once it became known that he had the information, everybody would think there's a huge cover-up. So do you see how in that situation, based on looking at it that way, people are looking at his behavior, and his behavior was making public that the FBI was going to continue their investigation. They would look at that behavior and they would say, it doesn't tell us anything about him as a person and his traits and his attitudes. It just tells us about that situation that he was operating under. Well, you can see we go through a lot of mental gymnastics to help make sense of why people do what they do. And that's what attribution theory is all about. Attribution theory is actually a group of theories, and we're going to talk about two of them. And they simply describe how we think about situations so that we can draw causal attributions, so that we can determine how to attribute the cause of someone's behavior. Let's first talk about Jones's correspondent inference theory. His theory really focuses on people's abilities to draw a correspondent inference between a person's behavior and their personality traits. And he would say that we're only able to do that after we have effectively evaluated three key factors. One important factor is the person's degree of choice in engaging in a behavior. Because as you would assume, freely chosen behaviors will tell me something about you. If you decide to freely engage in some behavior, that should be diagnostic of who you are. Now, if I force you to do something, that's not going to tell me as much about who you are. So keep that in mind. Now, this research is based on a situation like this, where some research participants are reading speeches that students were writing. Now, in one set of situations, the speeches that the students wrote were freely chosen by those students. So they were told that they had to write a speech about Castro, and that's because this research took place in the 60s when Castro and Cuba were in the news a lot. But the research subjects were told that the students were able to pick between writing a pro-Castro speech or an anti-Castro speech. And if a student simply decides on their own to write a pro-Castro speech, we would assume that this student is pro-Castro, and that's what the tall bar represents. However, if a student writes an anti-Castro speech, we would assume that the student is relatively anti-Castro, and that's what the short bar represents right here. Now imagine that we add another couple conditions to this study, and the research participants are now evaluating students who wrote speeches, either pro or anti-Castro, but now they're told that the students were assigned the topic and they were assigned the position. So when you're reading this speech, it's the exact same speech that was being read by these people. You're being told that the student was told they had to write a pro-Castro speech. Do you see how that shouldn't be quite as diagnostic about the student? So later on, when I'm asked to predict as a research subject how I think the true attitude of the author would rank from very pro-Castro to very anti-Castro, they're seeing the person as somewhat less pro-Castro than when that behavior was freely chosen. And the same thing over here. When people are reading an anti-Castro speech, when the student was assigned to take that position, later on they were asked to figure out what's the true attitude of that speechwriter. And you can see in this situation, they didn't see this student as quite as anti-Castro as when the student was able to pick that position on their own. So what we learn from this research is the degree of choice that corresponds with the behavior is very diagnostic in helping us understand why the person engaged in the behavior. The expectedness of the behavior is also diagnostic. If you engage in a behavior that's expected by our society, it doesn't really tell us much about you. It just tells us about our society. But if you engage in a behavior that's very unexpected, that now tells us something about you. So to the extent that you engage in unexpected behaviors, I would be able to draw a correspondent inference between your behavior and who you really are. Another thing that we think about are the intended effects or consequences of the behavior. If there are lots of positive consequences that are associated with the behaviors you engage in, then it's kind of hard for me to draw that correspondent inference between your behavior and your personality, because you might be engaging in those behaviors because of the positive consequences. But if you engage in a behavior that has very few positive consequences, then I can draw that correspondent inference between your behavior and your personality, because it's essentially the only reason you would engage in that behavior. You're not being rewarded for it. It must tell me something about how you truly feel. Let me put all that together into an example for you, and we'll see if we can clarify this a little bit. Let's say that there's a faculty meeting, and let's further assume that faculty are relatively liberal, because faculty do tend to be relatively liberal. they are more likely, I would assume this is true, it's certainly the stereotype, they are more likely to vote Democratic. Let's assume for this example that that is true. And let's assume that a faculty member, this guy right here, comes to the meeting dressed like this. So he's wearing his Hillary for Prison t-shirt, and he's wearing a Donald Trump Let's Make America Great Again hat. All right, so these people are trying to make sense of this man and his behavior. And what's the behavior? Coming to a faculty meeting dressed somewhat inappropriately, because you can see how these people are dressed. They're dressed like kind of business casual, and they're clearly not wearing their political affiliation out for everybody to see. All right, so the first thing that they're thinking is, to what extent was this guy free to choose what he wears? Faculty members can wear anything they want. So because he freely chose what to wear that day, they're able to draw that correspondent inference between his behavior and his true personality traits and attitudes. And based on that information alone, they're able to say, he's probably someone who supports Donald Trump. Another thing they're going to look at is the expectedness of the behavior. Coming this way to a faculty meeting is completely unexpected. We can see again, these people are all dressed in kind of business casual attire. He comes very casually dressed. So because that's relatively unexpected, they're again saying, hey, you're not going with the flow here. This must really tell us something about who you are. You must really be someone who supports this particular candidate. Let's look now at this third factor, the intended effects or consequences of that behavior. So what are the consequences of coming to a faculty meeting dressed this way? Well, it's possible that some of his colleagues might not really appreciate that, and they might kind of look at him a little bit funny. Do you see to some extent he might be punished for doing that? Well, I can't think of really almost any desirable outcome in this type of situation if we're assuming that these people are all relatively liberal. So because there's essentially no upside to wearing this type of outfit on this day of the faculty meeting, again, we can draw a correspondent inference between his behavior and his attitudes, saying that he must really be a Trump supporter. Let's add into this situation, though, a little bit of extra information, and you can see how we can analyze this entire situation somewhat differently. Let's say that all of his colleagues find out later on that he was actually put up to this. And someone thought it would be kind of funny if he came to a faculty meeting dressed this way, and they offered him a lot of money. Now do you see it's a little bit harder to draw a correspondent inference between his behavior dressing this way and his true attitude? Because now there are actually some consequences of his behavior, and they're pretty desirable. If he wears this to this faculty meeting, he's going to make a lot of money. So now I'm starting to think he might be engaging in those behaviors not because he's a conservative and because he supports Donald Trump, but because he's going to get some money out of it. Well, what I'm trying to do is just help you understand here that these are some of the key elements that we look at consciously or unconsciously when we're trying to make sense of someone's behavior. And if someone's behavior is freely chosen, if it's relatively unexpected, and if there are few positive consequences for engaging that behavior, then we can easily draw a correspondent inference between that person's behavior and their underlying personality traits. But if that person's behavior was forced, if that person's behavior was relatively expected, it's the type of thing that everybody engages in, and if that person's behavior was then rewarded, if there were a lot of positive intended consequences of that behavior, then it's a lot harder to draw a correspondent inference, because it could be that the person's behavior is more a result of what they were forced to do, what everybody does in our society, or because of the money that they received. All right, well, I hope that's beginning to make some sense. Kelley's covariation theory has been pretty popular over the years as well. It's based on the covariation principle. The idea is relatively simple. Causes of behavior are present when the behaviors occur, and they're absent when those behaviors do not occur. So the whole idea is that we're able to perceive this covariation. When some cause is present, a behavior occurs. Take that cause away, the behavior will not occur. Let's go through a silly example real quickly. Look at Superman. He's really strong, he can fly, he can do almost anything. However, we learned both from comics and from the movies that if he is exposed to kryptonite, he becomes very weak. So when that cause, kryptonite, is around, his weakness occurs. Take the kryptonite away, he's not weak, he's very strong. Bring it back, he's very weak. We notice that covariation, and thus we can notice the cause of that particular factor, the kryptonite, on his strength or weakness. All right, well, just imagine that same type of thinking. We're able to perceive covariation. And there are 3 different types of covariation information that Kelley would say are very influential in how we attribute causes to people's behaviors. Let's just quickly go through each one of these factors, and then we'll go through some complete examples. So one is consensus information. So how do other people react to that same stimulus in question? Another important piece of information, distinctiveness. So does this person that we're trying to understand react the same way or differently to other types of stimuli? And the third important piece of covariation information is consistency in a person's behavior. Is the person's behavior consistent over time? We would assume that if it's consistent over time, it will be more diagnostic of that person. Let's put this together with some examples. Here's an example that comes right out of your textbook. And again, we're looking at these 3 pieces of information: consensus information, distinctiveness information, and consistency information. And according to your textbook, imagine this scenario. You're coming down the street, you walk past a movie theater, someone's really excited about a movie that they just saw, just a stranger, and they start talking to you about it, and they're raving about how great this movie was. Well, you don't know the extent that you can trust this person. You don't know if this person is raving about this movie because the movie is really good, which would mean it's something about the stimulus, or if this person just kind of loves movies and loves to talk about it. In other words, the person might be raving about the movie because of themselves. So let's go through some of the information that people might evaluate, in order to make sense of that. Consensus information. Let's say the consensus information in this case is low. Other people do not rave about that film. So the general consensus is people don't seem to like the film, but this person really does. Do you see already right off the bat? It seems like we're learning more about this person than about the movie. Distinctiveness information. Let's say that is low. The stranger raves about many other films. So as you're talking to the stranger, it's not like the stranger was loving just this film so much, but the stranger was also talking about other films that you should really see. So again, it seems like we're learning something more about this person than about the film. Consistency information. Well, let's say you encounter this guy again, and again, he's raving about the film. When you put together this type of pattern of data, it seems like we would end up making a personal attribution. It's something about that stranger that caused their behavior, something about the person that caused them to rave about the film. Now compare that with this type of pattern of behavior. Let's say that the consensus information is high, and not only is this stranger raving about the film, but other people are raving about the film as well. Do you see how already, right off the bat, we're starting to think there really might be something about the film here? Everybody's talking about it. Let's say the distinctiveness information is high. The stranger does not rave about any other films. So let's say this person even says something to you like, you know what, I don't like practically any of the movies that are in the theaters nowadays, but this one is really good. Again, do you see how this is really pointing to something about the film now, something about the stimulus? When we look at this type of pattern of results, this is likely to lead to a stimulus attribution or some type of external attribution. It's something about the film that caused this person's behavior. So according to Kelley, we look at these key pieces of information to help to understand people's behaviors. I know this is a little bit confusing, so let's go through another example or so. Let's imagine a situation where someone named Joe kicks a dog, and we're trying to make sense of that. Why would Joe kick this dog? So let's go through this pattern of results. Let's say the consensus information is high. Everybody kicks this dog. I know these examples are kind of silly, but it just gives you a sense of what's going on here. So everybody kicks the dog. Already we're starting to see, all right, maybe it's not something about Joe. Why is everybody kicking this dog? Consistency information. So Joe always kicks this dog. So now, again, that does make us think something about Joe, but we are keeping in mind that other people are engaging this behavior as well. Distinctiveness, high. Joe doesn't kick any other dogs. All right, so now we're realizing Joe's not a horrible person. So when we put together all this information, what kind of attribution do we make? Likely external. It's something about this dog. Other people want to kick him. Joe kicks him when he's around him. However, Joe doesn't kick other dogs. It's something about that dog. The dog's vicious. Let's go through another pattern of results. Let's say the consensus information is low. So it's only Joe that kicks this dog. Other people aren't kicking this dog when they encounter it. Consistency information. Joe always kicks this dog. Do you see how we're starting to form an impression about Joe? Distinctiveness. Joe kicks all dogs. All right, now we're really learning something about Joe. Now we're going to make an internal attribution. Joe is the vicious one here. He seems to like to kick dogs. Let's go through yet another potential trend of results here. Let's say the consensus information is low. Only Joe kicks this dog. So again, we're starting to think it's something about Joe. Consistency information. Joe sometimes kicks this dog. So now we're not exactly sure what's going on there because he's not always doing it. Distinctiveness information. Hi, Joe doesn't kick any other dogs, only this particular dog. Do you see how in this situation, the pattern of results leads it to be somewhat ambiguous? We're not really sure if it's something about Joe or something about the dog in trying to explain his behavior. So I gotta tell you, these things kind of give me a headache. I just want you to be relatively familiar with the whole idea that we go through a lot of mental gymnastics to try to make sense of people's behaviors. And according to Kelley's covariation theory, we're looking at consensus information, consistency information, and distinctiveness information. That's about it for this section, but stay tuned because there's more social psychology coming up soon.